My name is Jesse. Yes, I'm a half-identical twin. Something that should not biologically happen. I can talk to you about it later if you're interested. But I'm a tech writer at a company called Cockroach Labs. We're a New York City-based startup building an open-source distributed SQL database that is memorably, evocatively, and yes, provocatively called CockroachDB. You probably remember this name from Ruthie's talk yesterday about the importance of naming things. In any case, that's not the topic of the talk. My talk today is called Bootstrapping Docs at a Startup, which I based on my experiences at Cockroach Labs, specifically on my first 6 months there. I've been there for about 1.5 years. And I want to start at the start of those 6 months because it helps clarify some of the focus for my talk. So the situation when I started was pretty common, I think, for tech writers at startups. I was the very first writer. CockroachDB, the product, had been in development for already about 2 years, so it was a solid, substantial product, and there were 15 core engineers building it out, and there were over 60 engineers in the community contributing to the product. There was absolutely no user-facing documentation aside from a README file and a contributing file. And a beta version was planned for release in less than 6 months, approximately. I didn't know the date, which that was intimately linked to them having hired me, a tech writer, because documentation needed to be there in time. So before going on, I'm just curious, how many people here are in a situation like this or have been in a situation like this? So a few. So if you're currently in this situation, I'm hoping that some of the things I say will be immediately applicable. If you've been in this situation, I hope it resonates with your experience, and I'd really love to hear feedback and talk about it afterwards. So when you're in this situation, how does it feel on day one? Well, of course, you know, for me, I was excited, I was enthusiastic. I loved starting at a startup, all the autonomy and the excitement there. But I also felt, you know, like this snail a little bit. I knew I had a goal, but I simply couldn't see it. I didn't know where it was. I didn't know how to get there. I needed to actually start moving somewhere pretty fast, but I didn't know where to head first. And I was really worried I would head down a whole bunch of you know, dead ends and waste a lot of time on my way. And to top it all off, of course, it was a very unnatural environment for me. No, you know, carrots and cucumbers and dandelion greens. It was a very flat, two-dimensional, not an environment with a lot of depth yet. So what do you do? This brings us back to the title and focus of the talk, Bootstrapping Docs at a Startup. Of those two terms, given where we are, docs is familiar to all of us, but what does bootstrapping really mean, and why is it important in the context of writing docs at a startup under conditions like I mapped out earlier? Let's think about just what a bootstrap is. That is a picture of my actual boot that I'm wearing right now. It's showing up here, it's not showing there. I'm glad you can see it. And that physical thing there is just a bootstrap. It's a loop that you use to pull the boot onto your foot, but a verb grew out of that, noun, evolving from the physical thing, from pulling the boot on, to the action of pulling oneself into or out of a situation using existing resources. So what this means for writing docs at a startup, my translation is, you gotta get yourself up onto your feet so you can write the docs your users need quickly, while establishing a flexible framework for expanding and improving as you go, using the resources at your disposal, which, contrary to a lot of conservative ideology, is by no means only your own bootstraps. You know, events like Write the Docs, the community out there, there's a lot of resources for you. I'm gonna call out at least a few of the past presentations here that really inform my decisions at Cockroach Labs. So what do? The basic process I follow breaks down into 3 overly simplistic phases: learn, prep, and build. I say overly simplistic because these phases make a complex undertaking seem really straightforward and simple, which it's not. In reality, as I'm sure you all know, you're always doing multiple things at the same time or in different orders, so it can get pretty messy. And these phases still seem meaningful to me as an overarching trajectory, but as the slide says, they're just too abstract and too huge, right? Like learning alone is just a gigantic task when you're starting at a company. Long term, you have to learn so much about the company, the culture, the product, the users who you want using the product, and you can go really, really deep in any of this. So it's important to always come back to the reality of your situation. You're bootstrapping. You need to learn, you need to prep, you need to build, but you also need to get up and running and be productive quickly. You don't have the time to go down, deep down every rabbit hole. So again, what do? Well, what works for me, in my experience, is to find concrete tasks that let you feed lots of birds with just a few seeds. And so for bootstrapping docs at a startup, the concrete tasks to start with, for me, and I'd suggest might work for you, are writing an FAQ, choosing the right tools for the job, and writing a Quickstart. And so these are the topics that I'm going to focus on. So starting with writing an FAQ. By FAQ, I don't mean here truly frequently asked questions. Pre-release, you don't have users. You don't have frequently asked questions. Instead, this is an exercise in identifying the questions that prospective users will need answered to get a clear sense of the product and its value, and to just make a choice about whether to try the product or not, which means this is also an exercise in emphasizing what the company wants users to know up front to encourage them to adopt. What are the questions you should try to answer? To both give users a clear sense of the product and to encourage them to adopt, I'd suggest you have the greatest impact by focusing on what makes the product unique or different within its market, its domain, while trying hard to consider users' existing frame of reference. There are likely resources to help you learn, to get you those insights. I'm going to highlight some of them in a bit, but the most effective way at a startup to kick off a project like this is to simply interview the founders and or the lead developers and split them off into different sessions, interview them individually, but start with the same exact questions so you can tease out as many essential nuggets as possible. And the kinds of questions you want to start with are big picture questions, like why did you build this product in the first place? What was the origin? What was the impetus for you? What problems do you think it solves? What pain do you think it takes away? And for whom? How does it compare to what's already out there? Why is it necessary in that context? These types of questions, they're going to lead you to insights you need, again, about the company, the product, and the users, and they're going to open up a lot of opportunities for you to dig in deeper. So ultimately, you're going to get to what makes the product different or special, which is where you want to be. And by way of example, at Cockroach Labs, those initial conversations helped me hone in on 4 key aspects or capabilities of the database that really set it apart. Scaling, surviving, being consistent, and SQL. These concepts themselves are not unique to the database. They're familiar and broadly understood in the domain of databases, so they're within the user's frame of reference. What's unique is that they're grouped together, and this was really crucial early learning for me. So not to go too deep down database lane, but typically the ability to scale a database across machines and set it up to survive those machines failing or entire data centers going out or other types of service interruptions in an automated way tends to get associated with something called NoSQL databases that don't offer a lot of guarantees around consistency and have these custom APIs, not SQL. Whereas data consistency guarantees tend to be associated with SQL databases that are historically difficult and manual to scale and to set up for survival. So understanding that these features grouped together is really what sets the database apart was sort of the key learning for me. And that's the hard work, that's the hard initial work. It takes a while, and once you've done that, you want to translate those topics into short, straightforward, familiar questions users might find in FAQs of similar products, questions they don't have to think very much about on first glance, so they serve as easy hooks, but they give you the opportunity to explain how the product is different and what its capabilities are. To come back to what you get from this, those interviews and having to sort of formulate these foundational questions and look into them, it does give you an initial depth of understanding of what you need, of the company and the product and the users, and that jumpstarts everything else, and there's lots of other questions you're going to have to answer. You also inevitably discover essential topics that are unfamiliar or difficult for you and that you need to spend more time on, and that's good to do early and upfront. And importantly, you really get a piece of content that's going to be one of the more viewed on your site for a long time to come, and this is not to be forgotten. So for example, on the Cockroach Labs website, the FAQ that I initially wrote, it continues to get around 5% of overall traffic month over month, which is significant. And it's especially visited by first-time visitors, so it ties into adoption pretty well. Before moving on to the next section around tools, I want to return to the questions of resources when you're bootstrapping like this. We talked about the importance of interviewing. I really think that's a great way to start. Beyond that, though, it's going to differ from company to company. You might get lucky, like I did at Cockroach, and have a lot of learning resources, but you might not. Some other things to look for, though, things that you might be able to read. Are there articles written in the press about the company, about the product? That gives you a really good external sort of lens on what's going on. Are there blog posts that the founders and the engineers have written, give you technical insight into the motivations, design docs, specifications, RFC, that's an open source sort of equivalent to specifications, give you insight into specific aspects or features. And then Wikipedia is just priceless when you're being introduced to an entirely new domain. I relied on it a lot when learning about databases. Also, look at whether there are recordings. Have they recorded lunch and learns, tech talks, meetups, those kinds of things. These recordings are an incredibly good way to introduce yourself to some of what the company's doing. Okay, so on to tools, choosing the right tool. Pretty early, you need to start thinking about this at a startup. What do you want to use to write and deliver your content? And you need to think about the workflows that go along with these tools. And real quick, unexpectedly to me, pretty much everything I'm going to say next was said wonderfully just 2 hours ago by Jody Petrino in her talk treating documentation like code. So thank you, Jody. Jody had an old picture of a woman with a typewriter, bicycle, and hair bun as her spirit animal. I'm just gonna call Jody my spirit animal here, and proceed. A lot of the stuff is the same, so I'm emphasizing. So when looking at tools, what's most important in a bootstrapping situation? To come back to what I said earlier, when you're bootstrapping, you need to write the docs users need quickly, establish a flexible framework for growth, and use available resources. So quick, flexible, and available/accessible are three considerations. Let's talk about each of them briefly. So to get productive quickly, things need to be relatively easy for you and for the people that you collaborate with. So whatever tool you choose, make sure that when writing your content, you can really focus on writing and not worry too much about presentation. When iterating, make sure you can evolve and update while keeping a clear history of changes, because you'll be moving fast, and you may need to try things out and revert frequently. When sharing your content, it needs to be easy for people to see what you're doing, and of course to offer feedback in a meaningful way. And if you intend to have others writing or editing docs for you, the tools need to be accessible to them, of course. So really, almost all of this is about usability and comfort for you and for the people you're working with. Tools are also at the heart of flexibility, of establishing a flexible framework for growing. And two key aspects here are design and integration. For design, you want it to be easy to design and redesign and redesign and redesign over and over again. You're going to do that a lot when you're getting the docs started. So can you easily build and customize a site structure? This should be easy with most tools, but you want to make sure, because it's going to grow and change. Do you have control of the site's look and feel? Easy control of the layout and styling of pages and page elements. You're probably going to want to make the docs match the branding of the overall company website. But even if you don't want to do that, it needs to be very easy for somebody else to get in and handle that work for you. And then in terms of integration, is it easy to integrate with other tools and workflows? So for example, to future-proof your docs, you're going to want to be able to handle versions and multiple authors. So does the tool work with source control, preferably the same one that the rest of the company is using? And is it easy to control and ideally automate testing and publishing the documentation? And then from day one, you're probably going to want to gather analytics on how your docs are getting used. So is it easy to connect to whatever analytics tool you prefer? That's the quick and flexible part. The available, accessible part, the main questions here are, Do you already know a tool that meets your needs? That's quick for writing, quick for collaborating, flexible in how it integrates with source control and other tools and workflows? If so, just absolutely use it. Save yourself a lot of time. You don't have that much time. If not, what suitable tool can you learn quickly? And what's appropriate for your startup in terms of culture and in terms of cost? But it's important, regardless of where you are, what tool you have in mind, you really should remember you're not alone when you're at a startup. There are resources out there. Likely there are engineers at your company who can or really even want to help you with the development side of the work, whether that's design, styling, learning source control, working docs into continuous integration. I think this is especially true at startups. You just need to spark conversations. But even if not, particularly around design, you may be able to get a budget to outsource the work, because this design ties into branding. Marketing often cares about that for an initial launch. And also, of course, to repeat, there are many community resources like Write the Docs. At Cockroach, I ended up leveraging literally all of the above. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about what we chose and why. So we ended up choosing GitHub for source control, Jekyll for site generation, and TeamCity for automated testing and publishing. And a bunch of these decisions were influenced by what I heard here in previous years. I'll talk about that in a sec, but a primary influence was that CockroachDB is open source. And so from the very start, even while interviewing, I understood that the docs need to be open source as well. And since the product code is in GitHub, it was a no-brainer for the source control of the docs as well. And that meant that I had a similar workflow as engineers, so I could benefit from their experience and expertise. And Git is not always easy. There was a workshop here a few days ago to help people learn Git. Collaboration in general is really great in GitHub, whether it's comment threads in GitHub issues for planning out work, or specific concrete feedback on docs you've written in pull requests, which are the mechanism by which you submit changes. And then, importantly, with some guidance, anyone outside of Cockroach Labs can contribute to the documentation, whether they're writing something, leaving feedback, asking questions, making requests. And then for site generation, rather than going with a CMS or a system with a backend like a wiki, I was drawn to Jekyll for its simplicity. You write pages in Markdown, which is a really easy format to learn, and in practice works for almost everything you need. There are some pretty prominent caveats there. All files are a part of a single project, so it's easy to view literally everything that goes into your website in Sublime Text or any other text editor you like to use. That includes layout and CSS files, so it's easy for you or engineers or anybody to have access to that. Jekyll uses a templating language called Liquid that lets you do all types of convenient things with your docs, from including reusable blocks, think DITA style, to writing if-then and looping logic to affect or actually build content based on metadata on a page or elsewhere. And then finally, Jekyll's a static website generator, so it just takes your files and outputs HTML, and then you just put those files in a web server, and that's that. And it's generally faster and a better user experience than systems with the backend, and it's just a lot simpler, a lot less dependencies. And there are a lot of other static website generators out there. I'm curious, how many people here use a static website generator for their docs? So there's a significant number. I mean, Jekyll's amazing. We're actually thinking of migrating over to a tool called Hugo that is basically the same thing. It's just written in Go, because CockroachDB is written in Go, so the engineers like that. So for automated testing and publishing, we went with TeamCity. This was already in use by the engineers, so it was an easy choice. And with their help, we managed to automate a whole bunch of things. For example, when someone opens a pull request in the docs repo, TeamCity runs the files through Jekyll and syncs the HTML output up to a test server. We use S3. And so reviewers can look at the raw Markdown files, but it's very easy for them to actually go and look at the rendered changes to the site. And we've even set it so that a link to those test docs get added as a comment in the PR. This is a trick I learned here at Write the Docs, as well as pretty much all the other ways we're using continuous integration. TeamCity also runs tests against the HTML to validate links and image properties and other things. And when these tests fail, the status is clearly visible in the pull request, and I can drill into it and figure out exactly what needs to be addressed. And then once tests are green and reviews are complete and you merge, the updated site gets synced up to our web hosting environment. In our case, it's GitHub Pages. So a lot of the workflow is really nicely automated, and it saves me a lot of time. I want to go back to existing resources here in terms of tool decisions. I mentioned earlier that some of my decisions were influenced by Write the Docs and some other venues. I want to highlight them now because they were so incredibly crucial for me. Tom Johnson, who did a great presentation yesterday on building docs navigation, he has a blog called I'd Rather Be Writing, which I'd been reading long before starting at Cockroach Labs, and there was a wonderfully informative series of posts on the pros and cons of using Jekyll versus Dida that really first opened me up to how much you get from an open source tool like Jekyll. And it led me to learn it and experiment with it on my free time, and eventually to use his equally open source Jekyll documentation theme as the basis for the Cockroach documentation. I also learned a lot about using Jekyll from Garian Tarikian's talk in 2015 called How GitHub Uses GitHub to Document GitHub. Garian also created a tool called the HTML Proofer that we're using to validate our HTML, so I learned about that as well. And then last year, I heard a lightning talk by Rachel Witten, who's here, and she's volunteering here, from Pantheon, about how they use Circle CI, which is another continuous integration tool, to run automated tests against each GitHub pull request. And so literally everything I just said about using TeamCity, I adapted from what Rachel said about using Circle CI. So these were really helpful for me. So to recap, what's important when choosing the right tools for bootstrapping? Make sure they enable you to do your work efficiently and quickly. Make sure they're flexible and let you control design and integration with other tools and workflows, and make sure they're easily available and accessible to you and to the people you collaborate with. And so with tooling decisions sort of in motion, at least, you want to move on to where, so to say, the rubber meets the road. And this is just a nonsensical image to go along with that I like. That is really building the content that you actually need to deliver, which is the Quickstart. So back to the bootstrapping guidelines, you need to write the docs your users need quickly. Previously, I highlighted the quickly part of that equation, but when starting on the heart of the content, you really need to shift your focus to what users truly need. And for me, this comes down to sort of two general categories: doing and understanding, like Dida's task versus concept. I expect that for initial docs at a startup, the priority is almost always going to be on adoption, on your docs getting people to actually try out and use the product. So that's primarily doing. There are some audiences out there that will only actually get their hands dirty with a decent understanding of the underlying technology. And that's actually another reason why it's beneficial to start with an FAQ, because you can actually satisfy some of those users' need for conceptual education up front. But for the most part, the most important guidance you can give early adopters is how to actually get started. So again, that's the quick start. This entails, identifying what actions, what tasks users must do to have a successful first experience, as well as what you believe users should do. This is nothing unusual for tech writers. We have to learn how to explain product usage all the time. But to do so in a startup situation, I actually think it's good to take a similar approach to the FAQ, and that's sort of working with other people. So to start, consider asking your peers to demo getting started, literally working through the steps, not just explaining them, with you observing, taking notes, asking questions. And again, it's going to help if you split these into multiple sessions, but ask different people to do the exact same thing and pay close attention to any differences in how people approach this. And then, having observed how others do it and thinking through the differences that you observed, repeat the process yourself on your own, completely on your own. Maybe everything will go smoothly, but it's very, very likely that strange things will happen for you that you did not observe happening for your peers. And these are really important because they expose probably prerequisites or assumptions that you need to understand and make explicit in order to guarantee a user's smooth start. But of course, when you run into blockers, pull your peers in, troubleshoot, resolve the issue, keep honing in on the clearest, simplest way. And that can really take a while, but once you feel comfortable, go back to the founders or to other people who know a lot about the product and actually demo it to them and make sure you've got it right. And then, importantly, get their help in figuring out what users should do next. And this is going to depend entirely on the type of product and audience that you're writing for. In my experience, consumer, business user-facing types of products, you probably need to understand basic use cases, workflows. Developer, admin-focused products, you probably need to focus on more essential generic technical tasks. So to make this more concrete, I want to briefly show how this played out at Cockroach Labs. In terms of must-do, CockroachDB is a database, so installation was a very big focus, and it involved understanding various methods of installation across different operating systems. And given the importance of the page and that it's the very first task anybody will ever need to do, I worked with design to get the user experience right and made sure that we were using analytics to track downloads and other kinds of events indicating installation. And then the next, and really the only other absolute must-do, was the process of starting the database. In CockroachDB, it's straightforward. It's just step one of this tutorial, a single command. So the rest of the page already crossed over into should-dos, but should-dos that are still really foundational. Since CockroachDB is designed to be a distributed database, we give users a first kind of simulated experience of scaling from one node to a cluster of nodes. Then, since it's a SQL database, we get users issuing queries against it using a built-in SQL shell. Again, just a few simple commands. Then we show them how to open the admin UI that comes along with any running cluster. And lastly, just the simple process of shutting everything down. So all in all, really, the install page and the start a cluster page are the quick start, everything a brand new user needs to try out the product. But with those must-dos covered, I focused the rest of the tutorials on features we thought users really should be exposed to. For example, we believe strongly encouraging security best practices. So there's a tutorial immediately after start a cluster that it goes through the same process, but this time with security certificates in place. Then there are a few pages going further into CockroachDB as a SQL database. When users hear it's SQL, they immediately want to know what variant of SQL, because there are lots of them, and we're closest to Postgres. So we provide a quick reference of the most essential statements, examples, and then a more detailed page about using the built-in SQL shell to actually make some SQL queries. But developers aren't, they're not going to interact with CockroachDB via a SQL shell. They're going to build apps on top. So then we provide a very simple, self-contained tutorial on building an app on top of CockroachDB, connecting it to CockroachDB. And this is really all about making things quick and convenient for any developer that's exploring the product. So we spent a lot of time building this out for multiple languages, and in each language offering multiple options. And then finally, we end with some self-contained tutorials walking users through the process of witnessing certain core capabilities of the database in action. So from how data is replicated and distributed in an automatic way to how clusters tolerate failures and sort of self-heal themselves. And these are really all about differentiating the product, and they're linked to from several places on the general website. And that's really the quick start. There are plenty of other docs that you need to tackle for an initial launch, but if you get this type of thing right, you're likely going to get some good traction with potential users. So to recap, write what users must do and in what order to get up and running with the product, and carefully think about and write about what users should do to have a successful and satisfying first experience. And that's bootstrapping docs at a startup. Writing documentation from scratch under a deadline is really all about focus in the end, figuring out how to write your docs, how to write docs your users need and how to do that quickly, how to establish a solid but flexible framework for expanding and improving as you go, and making sure to use resources at your disposal. And the way I got that started at Cockroach Labs in a way that may work for you is write an FAQ that gives users a clear sense of the product and encourages them to adopt. Choose tools that let you get your work done quickly and flexibly and that are right for your situation. And write a quick start that gets users up and running with the product and gives them a successful and satisfying first experience. And that's it. Thank you.